Hi everyone, my name is Zakaria Ahmed Salim. I'm the director of the Institute for the Study of Islamic Thought in Africa and an associate professor of political science here at Northwestern University. I would like to welcome you all to this fourth ISITA Dialogue. This is a series of book discussions focused on Islam in Africa. Today we are extremely excited to welcome Alex Thurston, whom we call one of our own, because to discuss his third book, Jihadists of North Africa and the Sahel, Local Politics and Rebel Groups, just out from Cambridge University Press. Alex is a professor at the University of Cincinnati in Ohio. He's in the Department of Political Science there. And he has written a first book on Salafism in Nigeria, which was published back in 2016. Another book in 2017 was with Princeton University Press, was devoted to Boko Haram, and it's now one of the most authoritative books on Boko Haram. And this is the third book that is, I think, the first attempt to take extremely seriously the jihadists in North Africa and the Sahel. So it's a trans-Saharan exploration of jihadism, trying to frame it as a political movement rather than only a bunch of fanatics, which I think they also are. Without further ado, please help me welcoming Alex Thurston once again to ISITA. Alex, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Zakaria and Rebecca, for having me, and thanks to ISITA and the Program of African Studies and Northwestern more broadly, and thanks to all of you for coming. Really excited to be here with all of you. So, one difficulty or challenge in writing a book like this is that events in this region are moving, so quickly, and the bulk of the writing took place in 2017, 2018, with revisions, through early 2020. But even since then, I mean, so many different, events and things have happened in the, in the Sahel, including obviously the most recent, kind of political earthquake in the region, the death of Idriss Deby, the former president, late president of Chad. So, this was my effort to kind of write a current history, but there's, so much that the book could not cover. And then also, gathering information could be quite challenging, right? There's, often conflicting accounts, even from, actors who were involved in key events firsthand. A lot of, some of the, most relevant information appears to, have taken place in, settings that are not easily accessible to a researcher, especially after the fact. And then there's the difficulties of, talking to active jihadists, which I was not, not really able to do. So, right away, I just want to be upfront about some of the limitations. In terms of the, scope of the book, so, geographically, it's attempting to cover, a number of cases in Northwest Africa, focused on Mali in some sense, but then also covering Algeria, Libya, Mauritania, Niger, and Burkina Faso to varying degrees. And historically, the book, looks at kind of, especially the 1990s to the present, but dipping, further back in time as necessary. In terms of kind of the intellectual context for the book, I think, in a way, it represents me trying to push back against three different paradigms. So the first paradigm would be, what I think of as, in its responsible form as a kind of terrorism studies, and then in its irresponsible form as a kind of terrorology. So with terrorism studies, right, the key problem, I think, has been analytically that terrorism studies has focused for a long time on kind of small, cell-based organizations. The commonality between groups has been their tactic, right? Terrorism is a tactic more than some kind of, identity per se. And I think that terrorism studies paradigm has struggled a bit, as especially some of the jihadist groups have turned into more mass movements, right? As they've held, territory, created sort of proto-states. Terrorism has been only one, arrow in their quiver, only one element of their arsenal and their approach. So a kind of terrorism studies, I think, can't necessarily capture the complexity of some of the movements that we see in in Northwest Africa or elsewhere in the world. Then too, I think there's a kind of, terrorology that is irresponsible, that comes out of academia, but that also comes out of think tanks and consulting firms and so forth, that is systematically alarmist in its analysis, that is systematically kind of top down, that understands jihadists in a kind of one-dimensional and depoliticized way. Part of me pushing back against terrorism studies and what I call terrorology has been, has overlapped heavily with a debate that one can see playing out in multiple, spheres now, which is basically the debate: are jihadists sort of fundamentally local actors who need to be understood in their local context, or are they, global actors who need to be understood as part of a transnational jihadist movement first and foremost? I've been, heavily on the sort of local side of that debate, especially in my book on Boko Haram. None of that is meant to like deny, the kinds of, clear sort of ties, right? There are many proven instances of financial transfers, of, communication, of formal pledges of allegiance. So, none of what I write is meant to deny that. But emphasizing the local aspect of jihadist movements, I think, helps to clarify the kinds of context that they operate in, the constraints that they face, and the variety in these movements. So on the one hand, you have this kind of local versus global debate, but this book also tries to make some modifications and to get past that debate in certain ways. So even though the word local politics is in the title, I try to do a couple things differently than this sort of local versus global debate, which I think has become a little bit kind of caricatured. First of all, as Zakaria alluded to, this is meant to be a regional book, right? A book that looks at actors in their regional contexts, right? So many of the actors discussed in the book operated in more than one country, were familiar with more than one place, succeeded in one arena and failed in another, etc. And I think, adding in the regional sphere can kind of complicate even some of the vocabularies that are used to talk about jihadists, right? So one example of that would be, we hear a lot in the study of jihadists about foreign fighters, right? The image of the foreign fighter can, conjure up the idea of somebody coming, say, from, Syria or Iraq to fight in a conflict theater in Africa. But when we're talking about, Algerians fighting in Mali or Mauritanians fighting in Mali or something like that, I think we're not talking about something that's the same phenomenon as foreign fighters going from one continent to another. And I think that the regional sphere kind of brings out, some of those complexities a little bit more. Also, in a way, so one modification is to go bigger, to go to the regional sphere. Another modification has been to go deeper, to go more local. So in the book on Nigeria, I sort of, emphasized kind of the level of Nigeria or of northern Nigeria, right? In this book, I try to get even sort of more granular, right? To look not just at, say, northern Mali as a political space, but to look at, differences between Gao versus Timbuktu versus Kidal, how different places were affected differently by, roughly the same set of events, or at least how different, micro events played out differently in different theaters, even within the same country or even within the same subnational zone. Another kind of, modification that I make to this kind of local versus global debate is to look at what political scientists talk about as the meso level of conflict, right? So not to look necessarily at the top jihadist leadership, not necessarily to look at the fighters and the grassroots, but to look at the kind of field commander level, to look at the decisions of actors who have direct supervision, direct face-to-face contact with the fighters, but who are not at the top of the command hierarchy. Another sort of modification I want to make is this emphasizing politics even more, So in my book on Nigeria, on Boko Haram, I kind of talked about Boko Haram as sort of a product of politics. But here I want to, here in this book, I really wanted to emphasize the jihadist field commander as a political actor in his own right. So as somebody who basically is embroiled in politics in the sense of having to manage a multitude of relationships around him. And it's almost always him. So I'll use the masculine pronoun. And these relationships I try to show in different parts of the book are not just about keeping the loyalty of his fighters or answering to his superiors or something like that. And it's not just purely antagonistic relationships with rivals or with the state or something, but that there's all sorts of relationships that the jihadist field commander faces that are gray and ambivalent in nature, that the jihadist field commander may find areas of alignment in one way with some other actor, but then be not on the same page with that actor in another aspect, in another domain. And then I also try to emphasize, and here too I want to break with kind of the terrorism studies model and emphasize that jihadist groups are coalitions, right? That they're not just made up, they're not sort of homogenous blocks of actors with all the same motivations and the same worldview. Rather, they tend to either form out of different pre-existing blocks or as a part of their evolution to develop blocks within them, such that even if a group starts off homogenous, it becomes sort of a coalition with the passage of time and with the emergence of different competing interests within the group. Okay, so these are some of my sort of pushing back against terrorism studies and also modifying this local versus global debate. Second, I want to push back against another model that I see as kind of like a sort of a technocratic sort of development-esque model that comes out of places like USAID or other sorts of technocratic actors like that, proponents of sort of development solutions and of countering violent extremism and so forth. What I want to push back against there is their sort of understanding of what they call like root causes of jihadism are often, I think, very depoliticized and kind of crude and sweeping in different ways. So some of the vocabularies, to talk about breeding grounds for terrorism, right, starts to my mind imply that local populations have no sort of agency, that jihadism just sort of comes in like a virus or like some kind of mosquito and then infects the local population, right? And that, the only sort of actors with agency in the process are the state and the jihadists. So I want to get beyond that kind of, view of local populations as essentially passive. Another sort of term that recurs in these kind of development spaces is this idea of ungoverned spaces, right? And this is similar almost to the breeding grounds in a way, but the idea that like either the state has control or it's chaos. And if it's chaos, then jihadists can come in and they can dominate it. And there's emerging literatures within political science and within other disciplines about alternative governance, about what's called heterarchy. But basically, the argument that there may not even be such a thing as ungoverned space, that even if the state is absent or weak, that alternative different orders, multiple power centers can emerge. And so one ramification of that for the study of jihadism is that jihadists can't necessarily just swoop in and prey on the local population that has no recourse or no sorts of resources. And here we should, emphasize too that often the jihadists themselves are, from the places where they operate in, or they're from the same region, right? So this kind of dichotomy one sees in different, writing about jihadism, the idea that jihadists are always from the outside and that the locals, again, are sort of passive victims of the jihadist virus. This is complicated by the fact that many of the jihadists are from the places where they fight and operate. Then, in continuing with like pushing back against this kind of development-esque countering violent extremism model, that model often understands what's called radicalization as either sort of a collective, like society-wide process or as some sort of individual process. And I think those miss kind of, either they go too micro or too macro, right? If you say that entire societies have been radicalized, first of all, I don't think the evidence bears that out. If entire societies were radicalized, I think one would see a lot more violence. And I think, this can become a form of Islamophobia or a kind of racism, right, to depict entire communities as being radicalized. And then if one goes to the micro level, right, and says, okay, this is all an individual process. It's all about individual people, misreading the Quran or hearing the wrong sheikh or something like that. I think what's missed is that, again, this like coalitional aspect of how jihadist groups form, that they seem to form out of, in a lot of cases, pre-existing social units, friend groups, social networks, etc. Right. So I want to find kind of, again, this like meso level that lets me look at, how do these coalition forms and how do these groups make essentially political decisions about where to affiliate themselves within a conflict. And then finally, the third paradigm that I push back against is political science literature on civil wars. I think more and more there's kind of acknowledgement of contingency and messiness and so forth, but a lot of the civil wars literature is still, I think, very sort of schematic, and this is, I don't know, to go even bigger, I guess this is my objection to some political science, in general, is the idea that, one single cause of a phenomenon can be isolated, that, X causes Y, and that everything else is just sort of noise. And this, I think, is a problem that some of the civil wars literature suffers from in particular, that there's been a search for these very sort of neat and elegant models of conflict, where X explains Y. What stands out to me looking at, Northwest Africa and the world, right, is contingency, is improvisation, is messiness, right? And I mentioned at the beginning the death of Idris Deby in Chad. I mean, this is maybe the most recent example of this, right? Who, everybody could have predicted that Idris Deby's rule would end at some point, right? Nobody lives forever, nobody lasts in power. Who could have predicted that he would be killed, out of the blue, in circumstances that seem partly unclear, during a set of very fast-moving events, hours basically after winning a sixth term, right? This highlights the role, I think, of messiness and contingency in shaping politics anywhere, but especially in a region like the Sahel. Okay, so then turning to, what I found in the book. I mean, I had a number of different kind of, findings and patterns that stood out to me. One pattern that really stands out is the difficulty actually that jihadists face in maintaining very complex coalitions. Aisha Ahmed has an article out recently, I want to say, about sort of boom and bust cycles within jihadist movements, and this is this partly relates to what I want to say here, that putting together a large coalition, getting into basically 5-digit numbers of fighters is extremely complicated and introduces all kinds of fractures and rivalries within groups. One example of that in the book is the Algerian Armed Islamic Group, or GIA. So by about 1994, they had attracted a number of different factions within under a single umbrella. And had brought in, even some relatively, I don't know, the word moderate is so loaded, but they had brought in some Islamists who were more moderate than kind of the core of the GIA. And then when one GIA leader was killed in 1994, it set off a process of people basically turning on one another within the group, and the coalition unraveled, almost as quickly as it had come together. So, these complex coalitions, these large coalitions, are very difficult to maintain. They almost sort of any, like, well, I don't want to say any internal shock or external shock, but any major shock can really start to fragment the coalition. And you can see something, vaguely similar in northern Mali, even before the French went in, but definitely after the French went in, different actors who had made up a very complex coalition during 2012 going different ways. Some of them going back into mainstream politics, some of them going, deeper into jihadism, some of the jihadist units themselves fragmenting and dispersing. So holding together large coalitions is just very, very complicated for jihadists to achieve. Another recurring dilemma or recurring issue for jihadists has been trying to balance between, or trying to find the right point of maybe what might be called overreach on the one side versus what could be called dilution on the other side. If jihadists, have power and are able to exercise some kind of government authority, it seems there are often voices within the coalition who are pushing for a very, very maximalist approach. If jihadists go in that direction and begin to, crush dissent, implement the most harsh version of Islamic law that they have in mind, they antagonize people, right? They antagonize the civilians around them, and they antagonize some of their own coalition partners who become, nervous or skeptical about this kind of, maximalism. On the other hand, if jihadists become too sort of accommodating, then they cannot placate the hardliners within their own ranks, and they're even at risk of sort of sacrificing and losing their brand. This is an issue, obviously, not just in the Sahel, but first and foremost in Syria. Here I'm sort of building on some things that Cole Bunzel has written about Syria, where there were direct accusations by jihadists against other jihadists, especially against the group HTS. That jihadism was being diluted, that it was being turned into something else through too many compromises. And one thing that I come back to a couple of times in the book is the question of whether there could even be a sort of a post-jihadism. In a way, jihadism appears so tenacious, right? And that could be taken as a sign of success. You look at the expanding theater of jihadist operations. You look at the ability of top leaders and of mid-level commanders and so forth to survive for years on end. You look at sometimes the financial resources that jihadists are able to accumulate. One could say this is extremely successful, right? These movements have really endured and thrived. On the other hand, there seems to be sort of a ceiling to what they can do, right? If they hold a fixed territory, then they will eventually be dislodged from that territory by a stronger military force, in this case, by an African military or multiple African militaries, or by Western militaries. This sort of like ceiling for their ambitions then, sort of, I think, means that they get trapped in cycles where they come back to these same dilemmas. Do we sort of water down to try to build a broader coalition, or do we go maximalist to try to, have the shock value of that and to placate the hardliners? So it's, in a way, even though they're so successful by hanging on, it's also somewhat sort of futile as a long-term project. And so then one question is, what sorts of experiments may emerge from the jihadist milieu in terms of post-jihadism, right? What sort of alternatives will they themselves generate to the current kinds of models? Another pattern in the book is, and this goes back to the idea of like heterarchy and alternative governance in different spaces, is the pattern where you get these kind of domino effects in terms of communities' alignments for and against jihadists. That this seems to be another kind of factor in capping what jihadists can achieve, is that they, again, are not sort of preying on this passive homogenous population, but rather, as they attempt to recruit within one ethnic group or one particular community, there's these domino effects, right, where they end up antagonizing another kind of community. Then that community begins oftentimes, say, ethnically profiling the group that the jihadists recruit from. And then you get these sort of, domino effects, which can leave jihadists then, with again, like substantial roles within the conflict, substantial ability to recruit within part of the population, but facing a real limit in terms of their ability to kind of rule over the population as a whole in any given area. Another sort of theme that I was exploring in the book, and that I maybe wasn't able to resolve to my satisfaction, that I'd like to explore further, is how being in the shadows politically, how being anathematized, how being on blacklists and so forth from the UN or the US, how this can be kind of a strategic resource for jihadists. That these blacklists are not necessarily just a punitive measure that constrain jihadist actions, but that give them kind of resources. So one way it can act as a resource, of course, is sort of the romantic appeal of being kind of outlaws being seen as pure, that this can have a kind of a recruitment effect. But I think there's also another advantage to this anathematization in terms of actors being able to, the jihadists who are in the shadows, who are blacklisted, being able to sort of offer, resources to their partners who are still in the light or who are still in the mainstream. That, again, not all relationships between jihadists and those around them are either fully cooperative or fully antagonistic, and that, whether it be, business actors, political actors, et cetera, that there can be advantages basically to sort of colluding with people who are in the shadows. Maybe I'll come back to that later on. Let's see. I mean, to give sort of a specific case, then, I mean, there's a lot of different figures in the book who I could try to, sketch their careers, but the most, I think, infamous, especially among the living, is Yad Ali. So the main, jihadist leader in northern Mali, and now since the death of Abdelmalik Drukdel in 2020, which was after the book was finalized. But in any case, after the death of Drukdel, Ali seems to be the preeminent figure, for jihadism in the Sahara and in the Sahel. And his itinerary demonstrates, I think, the complexity of jihadism, right? So, somebody who's had multiple incarnations, born in Mali in 1958, a father who was involved in some way, right? There's conflicting accounts, but involved in some way in the early 1960s Tuareg-led rebellion in northern Mali. Somebody, Yad, who spent time as a young man in Libya, elsewhere in North Africa and the Arab world, who came back to northern Mali to lead the 1990 rebellion, not on a jihadist basis, but on a sort of a regional self-assertion basis. Somebody who had then an extraordinarily complex career after that, as an interlocutor for multiple Malian heads of state, as a Malian diplomat based in, Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, as a religious activist with the global missionary movement Tabligh, and then finally as a jihadist, right? And that there's these sort of, ambiguities in his career, even up through the Northern Malian rebellion of 2012, that his turn to jihadism, and I was able to interview a number of people who had known him well, and even among people who had known him well, there was a little bit of conflicting accounts, right, about whether he had become an ideologically completely hardened jihadist, and whether this was completely ideological, his turn to jihadism, or whether it was in fact the different ways that the chips fell in 2011 in the lead up to the rebellion that kind of pushed him to align himself with the jihadists. So interestingly, even though Ali had been well down the path of kind of jihadist thought, or at least very conservative religious thought by the time of 2011, when the Northern Malian rebellion was in preparation, he sort of seems to have bid for leadership of the MNLA, of this, nationalist, Tuareg-led rebel movement, right? So even up till almost the final moment, he was kind of, bet hedging. Then when he formed Ansar ad-Din, or, Defenders of the Faith, however one wants to translate it, in late 2011, early 2012, he then put together a very complicated coalition too. Drawing in hardened jihadists, working directly with Al-Qaeda's affiliate in Northwest Africa, but also drawing in some of the major, Tuareg politicians of northern Mali, former and future parliamentary deputies, veterans of, past rebellions and so forth. And so built this, again, like highly complex coalition. And then, as I mentioned before, in 2013, when the French went in, that coalition fragmented. A lot of the major Tuareg politicians went back into mainstream politics. Yad Ali went sort of further down the route, or the path of jihadism. More recently, though, he's, expressed willingness to negotiate with, the Malian government, at least in theory. There was a major, exchange of hostages in 2020. So there are still these kind of, ambiguities about who this person is and what he wants. Maybe one other thing to mention then, and then I'll have a few closing remarks, is that one thing that I think shows the value of looking not just sort of at the national level, but also at the subnational level, is that even under Yad Ali, you get kind of very different coalitions in different parts of Mali. So in the north, where he's from, you have, I think a fairly sort of top-down model of jihadism. You've got major figures from the north, align themselves with him at different points, and he himself is a major sort of power broker. In the center of Mali, where you have units that are at least, theoretically under his control, you have a much more sort of bottom-up form of jihadism. Not a lot of sort of prominent, no prominent politicians that I could think of involved with jihadism in central Mali. Amadou Koufa, the kind of main jihadist leader under Iyad in the center, himself seems to be more, somebody who was a minor preacher before the conflict, and then has, his star has risen because of the conflict. But in any case, he there and this movement JNIM appear to sort of channel the frustrations to some extent of the down and out in central Mali. So anyway, my point is that, even within a single country, even within a contiguous conflict zone, you can have very, very different parts of the same movement, right? This sort of top-down model in the north, and then a more sort of bottom-up model in the center. And you see that too in terms of patterns of violence. So even though politically, a lot of people, including me, still think of Kidal in northern Mali as kind of the political epicenter of the conflict, it's not really that violent in Kidal, especially compared to like Mopti and Segu and so forth, central Mali, where you get this kind of mass multi-directional violence. So, the nature of the jihadist coalition can look different from place to place. And then the nature of the violence can also look different from place to place too. I'll close, I guess, with a couple different, policy implications that I took from the research. One is that, it has seemed to me that, a lot of the policies that have been, attempted by states in Sahel region have been informed and shaped by the war on terror. And what has stood out to me in those policy responses is just the recurring kind of collective punishment. So collective punishment of civilians writ large, collective punishment of specific ethnic groups, especially the Pul/Fulani. And this, has been such a pattern that I think it's a recurring feature of the war on terror, that it's built in. It's not sort of an accident. It's not like, oh, there's sort of overreach at the unit level, or there's like bad commanders, or it's like this particular head of state is prone to use violence. Like, it's such a pattern that it seems to be, sort of a feature of the current kind of, counterterrorism, counterinsurgency model is collective punishment. Another, sort of conclusion that I've come to, and this is a point of really, really active debate among analysts, but that is that the foreign counterterrorism presence is counterproductive. That that the French presence distorts the political field in various ways, that French, battlefield gains, the assassination of individual jihadist leaders are sort of fleeting, and that then you have, the violence getting worse and worse, especially from 2017, the political, systems getting more and more fragile, right? A lot of people have been pointing out this week, now you have Idriss Déby's death recently in unclear circumstances, a hectic situation in store for Chad. You have, a contested election in Niger, plus, what was I going to say? Plus an attempted coup, right? Or at least a reported attempted coup. You have the successful coup in Mali. The region seems to be getting like more fragile over time. So like, if the theory is that the foreign counterterrorism presence sets the stage for political progress, that seems not to be happening. Then the question becomes sort of like, what are the alternatives? And the idea of dialogue has been floated a lot, and I've floated this, a lot myself. And this has been a suggestion coming from, Malian actors, and there's been reports of agreements in Burkina Faso and attempts in Niger and so forth. The idea of dialogue is obviously really, really complicated, right? Could jihadists be trusted to engage in a dialogue, let alone to follow through on their commitments? What would be actually up for debate or agreement, right? Is the secular nature of Sahelian states up for discussion at all? If so, what is the alternative to like laïcité, right? Is there some kind of token implementation of Sharia that would be, that would be possible, or would jihadists demand something more sweeping? And then how would hardliners within the jihadist camp react, right? Would negotiations fragment jihadists in a productive way, such that it would make the conflict easier to manage, or would negotiations fragment the jihadist milieu in a counterproductive way, such that things would become even dicier? So, dialogue is not, despite the fact that I've favored it and continue to favor it, it's definitely not sort of a silver bullet. And then last, and this gets to another limitation of the book, one that I mentioned at the beginning, is this question of what collusion occurs, right? A lot of interlocutors that I talked to had what I would call conspiracy theories, right? The idea that France deliberately sort of fosters insecurity in the region in order to extract natural resources. I don't agree with that. The idea that Algeria is the puppet master behind the strings of all jihadists in the region, I don't agree with that. But making more sort of moderate claims, there seem to be instances of collusion, at least at the local level, that resurface, and you get this not just in this region but in other regions as well. There's for example, the Associated Press had a report about the handover of Mukalla city in Yemen in 2016 from AQAP to the UAE, basically, which suggested this was not completely a process of just fighting it out, right? That there are already these kind of that there are already channels and agreements that occur between states and jihadists. So I think one implication of that for me is that I think more of that should be brought into the light, right? That this is dangerous if you have sort of collusion and backroom deals. Better in my mind to have open dialogue, regardless of whether it's productive or not, than to have kind of behind the scenes collusion or rumors of collusion even. So I'll stop there. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Great. So thanks, Danny. You read my mind. I think that I've tried to build on Bayat's idea of this post-Islamism, that actors become frustrated with the paradigms that they're in and feel that the paradigms that they're in aren't working, right? And that they want to get they want to get to something new, right? Something that will work. I didn't end up talking, I hope, Zakaria, that you're not disappointed in me, but I didn't end up talking about Mauritania that much in this presentation, but that's where it comes up most for me in the book, is in Mauritania, because you have actors who continue to be fairly hardline, who continue to reject democracy, who continue to even favor jihadist action in certain circumstances, but who also at least say or appear to recognize that jihadism is futile within Mauritania, within a lot of contexts, etc. So there does seem to be this kind of frustration that then leads to that kind of post phenomenon.
You also discussed the post-Islamism as if Bayat notion in the introduction. So you draw on it early on in the book.
Yeah, it definitely made an impact on how I think about it.
Okay, I guess now Khaled can ask his question.
Thanks, Alex, for that wonderful presentation. It's good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you.
I have a question. I've been thinking about, a lot about this. First of all, congratulations on the book. It's a wonderful book, and I have my student reading it. So it's and some of them are here in the audience. But I have a question that I wanted to ask you about, the use of jihadists and jihadism, and I'm here thinking of the work of Asma Asfaruddin and Sherman Jackson, especially Sherman Jackson in some of his works, when he used this term haraba, and I'm here thinking if are we, I'm just thinking here about, are we in a way contributing to the problem by continuing, and then especially you mentioned in the beginning, we're pushing about against some of these studies about terrorism, and so are we contributing a way to the problem if we continue to use the term jihad when Muslim scholars, classical Muslim scholars, And in the Quran, we have the term haraba that is specified, that exactly what these extremist groups and terrorists do is it can be qualified as haraba, that the Quran talks about it, which is, and this is Chairman Jackson mentioned this in an article that he wrote, I think back in 2000, when he compares what these activists, these terrorist groups and the extremists are doing is exactly what the United States, what the FBI defines as domestic terrorism, which is creating public fear and, you know, creating disorder, and that's what this extremist group, you know, engages in, and so should we rethink the terminologies and start to use the concept as haraba, which is the Quran describes as the right word, or there are more nuances that I'm overlooking here that, you know, so thank you. That I just want to, you know, see if you could share something.
Thank you. Do you want to take a few more, or you want to answer this immediately?
Let me go one by one if you don't mind, because I think keep my thoughts straighter that way. Yeah, I mean, I'm highly sympathetic to that line of argument. I mean, and I think that there's good reasons to think that. You know, Yad Ali in the introduction to his Universal Enemy, I mean, he rejects this term jihadism, right? He points, you know, to the a couple problems with the idea. I mean, beyond the ones that, or in addition to the ones that you mentioned, right? That, you know, that states have sometimes declared jihads or talked about themselves as you know, leading jihads and so forth, but we use the term jihadist to refer mostly to non-state actors. I have stuck with it because I find it sort of the least bad of what I see as the major options. So I don't like terrorists because I think it references a tactic, right? And I also, you know, to be sort of blunt, I mean, I think you know, terrorism has become a label for designating what the speaker deems politically unacceptable violence, right? That terrorism is sort of an epithet, right? And that's not to condone the actions of any of the groups I talk about in the book, but I just find for me, it's not like that great of an analytical term. I also just don't, and this is my objection to the idea of like extremists too, you know, is that, I don't see that much in common between the jihadists and actors like the Irish Republican Army, or, you know, the Proud Boys, or, you know, whoever it may be, right? Or, you know, or different, you know, European groups in the 70s or something. I mean, I know one can draw parallels in terms of their use of violence and maybe sometimes their internal, you know, organizational dynamics or something. But to me, the specificities of groups have stood out more. And I mean, I don't want to hand jihadists the mantle of ownership over the concept of jihad, right? Just like I don't want to hand Islamists the mantle of owning Islam. But I think, I don't know, or maybe this is a cop-out, but I think partly the terms are so widely used that I'm sort of still mirroring the vocabularies of the people that I read. But then also, I mean, to me, jihadist is not like a positive term. It sort of refers to their like ideologization of jihad, right? And their distortion of it. But I think, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I think at some point there's going to have to be an alternative. I mean, maybe muharibun or something, but I think that could be a little esoteric for sort of the average reader too, at least in the English context. But no, I mean, I can't fully defend the choice beyond saying that I think it's the least bad of the alternatives I've seen.
Thank you.
All right.
I can take Sean's question in the chat.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, this is like super fast moving stuff, but I mean, I think, you know, a lot of analysts were noting the difference between the US statement, which referred to, you know, wanting to see constitutional procedures observed, versus the French statement, which did not make a reference to that, right? And a lot of praise from, you know, the French minister of the armies and so forth for Déby's role in counterterrorism. I mean, maybe this is too cynical, but I think that, you know, as long as Washington and Paris see the person who takes over, in this case Déby's son, as reliable and not erratic, that they will accept it as a fait accompli. And you know, if he organized elections and ran in them and won, I think they would accept that too. I mean, I think, you know, on the whole, I think that the US and France have tended to accept senior officers' coups in the Sahel, right? Mauritania is a key example of this. You know, Niger 2010, you know, Mali 2020. The exception, I think, is junior officers' coups by figures who are seen as too erratic, right? So 2012 in Mali, you had a lot of pressure right away for Sanogo and so forth to step down, but I think that's because he was low ranking, he was, you know, unknown, and yeah. But maybe I'm too cynical. I mean, yeah.
No, thanks. That's really helpful. It's great.
To Danny's question in the chat, yeah, I don't think I deal with, like, you know, Wa and Keppel too much in the book. I mean, yeah, I think, I mean, there was that, like, New York Times article that talked about, you know, what is it, the Islamization of radicalism versus the radicalization of Islam. I mean, I don't know, I would probably sort of reject both, but I mean, I definitely don't want to talk about the radicalization of Islam. I mean, I think I think Keppel has strayed sometimes into Islamophobia. But I think Wa may be too quick to sort of say, you know, oh, these guys would have been Marxists in the 70s and now they're jihadists, right? That it's all just sort of like a fad.
You have several questions in the chat, so.
Yeah, so I'm like having trouble scrolling.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm looking at James Stone's question.
Yes. The dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. I mean, you know, and recently there's been, you know, reporting out of this town called Farabougou in Ségou, you know, where there's been this kind of local level accord. I mean, but there seems to be these you know, patchwork of accords. And I think there must be a lot that go unreported. I mean, one fascinating part of the research was somebody from a Dogon community in central Mali gave me a copy of a letter that the jihadists had sent to his town, to the leaders in his town. You know, and that was something that was never reported in the media. So there must be all sorts of these little, you know, deals or efforts at deals. But what that adds up to, and who really has the authority to speak, you know, for jihadists as a whole, this is tricky. I mean, you know, there's in 2017, Kufa was asked about this. He said, you know, any political deal has to run through Yad Ali, but what is Yad Ali's level of authority over his subcommanders? What is Kufa's level of authority over the unit leaders below him? Yeah, it's a great question. So I don't know, you know, how you get to something cohesive, but I think it's worth a try. I mean, and I think that, you know, if the state expresses more willingness to talk, and if France gives more space for talks, I think that you know, some of this could maybe come out of the shadows a little more, and it could be seen what it adds up to. But I don't know. Maybe I'm too naive on that point.
I read Tim White's question for you, and it's actually dovetails with Danny Postel's question about Islamization of radicality. He's asking you, and this is somebody who's been in the region in the 70s, and he says that back then the resistance was not framed in Islamic terms, whereas now it's framed mostly in Islamic terms. So he is asking if you can take a step back and explain how that shift occurred and when, and then whether you think that people are framing their grievances now in Islamic terms as opposed in modern terms back in the 70s.
Yeah, this is a great question. Maybe that would you know, lean more toward the Olivier Wa side of the debate. I mean, I do think there's been a change over time. I mean, I don't know. It'd be hard for me to like sum up all the factors. I mean, I don't think that the model of just like, oh, you know, and I'm not saying anybody's saying this, but I hear this a lot, right? The model of like, you know, Saudi Arabian petrodollars exported sort of Wahhabi Islam around the world. It radicalized people, it prepared the ground, and then you get violent movements. Like, I don't think I think that that's too sort of simple. But I do think that there were religious changes within societies around the world. There was sort of a spread of different movements. I don't think that there's sort of like a pipeline, right? I don't think, you know, you could say with somebody like Yad, right? Okay, first he was in Tabligh, then he was a Salafi, then he was a Jihadi, right? But I think it's much more complicated and murky. But I do think the factor of like, changes in Islamic discourse play a role. I think that, the collapse of the Soviet Union obviously plays a role. We're talking about, a post-Cold War context. I think that the Afghanistan experience and sort of a diaspora of people going from, the quote unquote Arab Afghans going back to their countries, began to spread a certain kind of model. I think that 9/11 had an impact on the thinking of some, Muslims around the world. I think that what was seen in the United States is an act of pure evil. I think some Muslims saw, not supporting bin Laden necessarily, but I think some people saw as like kind of a strike at, Western power or Western imperialism. I mean, no, it's a great question that I would have to think about more. I mean, and I think generational change must play a role too, that, what the failures of the previous generation, in terms of different kinds of militant movements, then inspire, later movements to go in a different direction. And for that reason, I mean, nobody can predict the future, but I think it's quite possible in, 2040 or 2050 that there will still be violent insurgencies in the Sahel, but that they won't be jihadist in character anymore. Maybe in part because of what seems to be the ceiling for what jihadists can achieve.
Okay, related to that, I have a question of my own. What do you make of this line of argument that claims that the GIA group, which you are dealing with in this book, infringement on Malian territory led to radicalization in the north using local connections? They were able to spread their message to find a safe haven, and that would radicalize Africa. Basically, Arabs radicalizing Africans. What do you make of that argument?
I mean, I think there was definitely a clear impact, right? Of Algerians coming, Mokhtar Mokhtar, Abdelhamid Abu Zaid, etc., coming and trying to set up shop in Mali in particular, but also in Mauritania and Niger. The amounts that they were able to obtain through kidnapping Europeans and ransoming them. I mean, upwards of even $90 million over a period of just a couple of years, before the Malian, before and during the Malian uprising. But I think, I mean, and this goes back to like the idea of local populations as not being passive. I mean, I think that there were reasons that they were welcomed by some, right? Mm-hmm. that they became extra firepower, that they became, additional political weight, that they, proved valuable, especially to people, if Mali had been completely self-contained, mm-hmm. Then maybe as the 2012 rebellion was in preparation in 2011, maybe Yad Ali would have been told to take a hike, and he wouldn't have had leadership of the MNLA, and he wouldn't have had, he might have had other options, but for him, it was a major resource, obviously, to have jihadists on the scene, some of whom were already local by that point. And then I think too, the jihadists, when they came, antagonized people, and there's that kind of domino effect that I mentioned earlier, that as they aligned with one group, with one political faction or with one, ethnic or tribal faction, that they antagonized others. And so if they found a foothold, it was always as a result of some kind of trade-off.
Mm-hmm. Do you have other questions?
Danny, thanks for I read that book about, probably like 15 years ago. I remember it made a huge impact on me. I wish I remembered it better. I should look back. I had him as a professor, actually. He was incredible.
Oh, right. I forgot. You were at Northwestern at the same time he was.
Yeah. I took a class from him about mafias. It was amazing. I can still remember verbatim some of the things that he said.
He's an extraordinary character.
Yeah, I should take a look back at the book.
Yeah, it came to mind in the context of this question of shifts, periods, but also, ideological shifts at the macro and micro levels.
Yeah, for sure.
I think we have still 3 minutes. If anyone was hesitating to ask their questions, this is, I think, the moment. We have some students, so I'd love to hear from them, whether in the chat or in person. No further questions?
I have one last question. What's next for you, Alex? What's the next book? Since you seem to crank one out every few months.
I think I'm gonna go a little slower at this point. I mean, I'd like to. I've actually been getting really interested in like the history of the Maliki madhab within the region, and like I think this is probably the last major thing I'm gonna try to write about violence. I mean, I think I'm sort of burned out on it.
One of the merits. I think one of the.
Abdul Basit had a hand raised.
Oh really? Okay, go, Abdul Basit.
Yes, congratulations, Dr. Alex, for your book.
Thanks.
Really very insightful as always. And sorry for some of the social media backlash you've been having recently with respect to what is happening in Nigeria about the pandemic.
And I can take it.
Yeah, we have only 3 minutes, remember.
Yeah, but my question actually is exactly what Danny Postel actually mentioned. Now that you've worked on Muslim intellectual networks on Salafism, on Boko Haram, and you've also researched other regions as well. What are the next projects we should basically expect from you? And you just answered that you're planning to focus on the Maliki madhab.
Answer that question.
Yeah, I'm particularly interested in the Mauritanian arena actually, and some of the like intra-Maliki debates there. So
what else?
Yeah, thanks.
Right.
Well, thanks a lot for having me. I really appreciate this.
Thank you very much,
coming.
and thanks to everyone who attended this talk. So the book again is Jihadists of North Africa and the Sahel, Local Politics and Rebel Groups with Cambridge University Press. It's a very insightful and very rich book.
Oh, thank you. Thanks again, everybody, for coming, and yeah, take care, everybody.